Hello and welcome back to the Decision Makers podcast. I am Hugh Woozencroft, back with you once again, hosting the podcast which is trying to put you in the room, take you behind the scenes of an industry that, as we know, is pretty secret to most of us, and hopefully we've been doing that pretty successfully so far. We've got another great episode for you today. Alongside me, Curtis Davies, the former Hull, Aston Villa, Birmingham City, West Brom defender, and of course Marlon Fleischmann, the co-owner, managing director at Unique Sports Group as well. We know how many great talents they have on the roster too, so great to be with you once again. Today's episode is going to focus in on the role of scouting and analytics in football. I know a lot of you Football Manager fans, career mode FIFA fans, fancy yourselves as scouts. So we're going to get the details from the people that do it on a day-to-day basis. Hopefully it helps you with your latest save, okay? Delighted to say that we've got someone with such vast experience with us today in the world of scouting. Steve Hitchen joins us. Steve's worked in the industry after his professional playing days ended as a talent scout. He's been a director of technical performance for Tottenham Hotspur, bringing in the likes of Luka Modric to the club. He's also been responsible for the signing of Luis Suarez whilst he was working with Liverpool under Damien Comolli. Also spent time as a scout with Derby County and Queen's Park Rangers. Has vast experience and is now the director of football with Unique Sports Group. Steve, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
I'm so interested to dive into this because it plays such a big part in football these days. The transfer window and who a team is going to sign is almost as important as results and goals these days. Fans celebrate them. Social media goes wild. And I guess that means that people like you have a much bigger responsibility within a football club. Something that happens all the time now is discussions about recruitment. We hear it more and more and more. Recruitment. The role of the manager is now just to coach the team. I don't want him choosing players. You know, you get fans saying, don't give the manager any more money. But ultimately, the recruitment department and the scouting department have taken on an increased importance within football. So just tell us what their role is these days.
I think there's all different aspects of the recruitment department, starting from the junior ages all the way up. I think when you start with the junior ages, it's obviously discovering talent, the most difficult aspect. Predicting young players and how they're going to evolve and how their career is going to look in the future is the most difficult. I think once it gets to the first team, it becomes more easy, or it should become more easy. Because obviously there's a lot more information, there's a lot more game view, you get a lot more video to analyse and watch as well. So it's easier for first team than it is for academy guys to predict the future, but it still comes obviously with a lot of pitfalls. The evolution of scouting has been massive. So I think the same principles that started with Arsene Wenger, who I think was the pioneer of scouting, him with Steve Rowley in this period of time, they were ahead of the curve. And I think more or less now every Premiership club and predominantly most Championship and even lower league clubs now have caught on and have gone down this similar model. Not just tracking players in their leagues, but also now tracking globally and looking at different aspects and different types of players and where there's value and where the players are of a similar level. Now it'll come down to also the economics as well. So it's evolved massively in this period. Some parts for the better, some parts for the worse. But yeah, there's a lot of flaws and there's a lot of ways of getting things wrong. I think it's a great job. It's an amazing job to be involved in.
I'm going to pick you up on that comment you made there, that some things for the better, some things for the worse. Already take us behind the scenes here. What do you think works really well? What things do you think not so well?
Well, I think now there's too many opinions. So I think we used to be a lot more on instincts. It used to be a lot more on the eye. It used to be a lot more on the feel for a player, the intuition, and now it can go the opposite way now with data. Also, the coach has to play a pivotal part, and by this I mean in terms of the recruitment process has to be correct in terms of picking the right coach that fits the criteria of the club. So, for example, there's certain clubs that we know have to play a certain way. So Tottenham have to play on the front foot. They have to be expressive. They have to play good football. Where you go look at other clubs, they have to play in a different way. Maybe they play a little bit longer, more more using the physical side of it. But I think this is where most of the parts have been flawed today, because the decision making in the process of picking the coach can flaw everything that comes with regards to the recruitment of players. So if we use Man United as an example, they've over the last 5 managers, you couldn't find 5 different contrasting managers. So it's no surprise then that your recruitment process has been flawed over the years, because you're picking certain players for a certain coach for a certain style of football, and then it changes, and then obviously it's a consequence of that player being picked by that coach for that style of football changing, and then you make a mistake. So we have these aspects at the moment that's causing a little bit of confusion in football. The manager has less input than he's had before, and as a consequence doesn't have the same feel for the player as a scout has.
Steve, when you speak about the coach and picking the right coach for the style of play, it's obviously that's very important. But is it also important that, when you do that recruitment of a coach, that they are ready to take over this group? Talking about somebody that's got a big personality potentially to take over the likes of a Manchester United, a Manchester City, and following the footsteps of the likes of Sir Alex or Pep. But also, if I use Sunderland as an example, they recruited Reggie Lebris from out of nowhere because he's good at working with young players. Hence the fact Sunderland right now are sitting nicely towards the top of the championship table because of what he's done with them. Now, do you think that's happening as much in terms of that personality and whether or not they're good with working with these groups of players, or do you think it is more stat based around what they've done and certain things of the way that they've played football?
I think it's club by club. I think it's a lot to depending now on the director of football model. So I think more or less every club has a director of football. They should cohere with what the football club is requiring. So, like I said before, certain clubs play with a certain style of player. They also recruit a certain age and a certain profile of player now as well for each position. So, for example, with Sunderland, you need a coach. Use Reggie Lebris as the example. It's somebody who has primarily worked with academy players. So he was in Lorient, he was in Rennes before this, working with the academy. So he's got a track record of improving players. He has a track record of educating young players, which Sunderland primarily is. There's a vast majority of French players in that group, so it's good to have a French-speaking coach as well. And then he's also a player that aesthetically plays good football, increases market value, because I think when you look at Sunderland today, there's a lot of assets that will increase in value, have increased in value over the last few years. So their business model kind of determines also the football model. So you see the balance at the moment, they're having a lot of success. Where they'll finish, we don't know. But the club is very, how can we say, it's been running a way where you can see there's going to be big progression, there's going to be big market assets. So whatever the consequences of where they finish this season, you can see that there's progression inside the football club and a clear idea and plan about what type of coach works for them, which type of players they're going to recruit and how they're going to move forward. Rightly or wrongly, we'll see over the course of the next few years. But I think in terms of, it's a nice example of a club with clear idea, clear identity, which makes it much easier for the coach.
Steve, just going back to what you said about ownership group, and it's one thing that I've seen a lot of, is if an ownership model changes, that whole recruitment process or the target list or the type of players that club are going for, that can change overnight. So you could have this big strategy of 3-year recruitment cycle models, bringing in players that you're going to sell in 3 years, as you said, as an asset class. But suddenly new owners come in and it is instant success. That must change. Does that put the fear into the existing scouting personnel at the club? New owners coming in, suddenly expectation levels are through the roof, instant success. Do you rip up scouting reports and go again?
I think the most successful clubs have stability and a clear process plan and everything. But as you say, of course, everything changes. Everything can change overnight. I think the way you see success, if you look at the Premier League, if you look at most of the clubs, Chelsea's probably an anomaly because they've changed a lot over the course of a few years. But even with Chelsea, the recruitment team have more or less been there for a long period of time, and there's been stability in this. nobody talks about the Liverpool committee. It's the same people that they had years ago that were getting vilified when they wasn't having success. They stuck with this group. They kept to the core principles. The ownership model stayed the same. Their recruitment models stayed the same, and they've competed with less budget, with less by being clever and having that stability. So, yeah, of course, things can change and things can get ripped up overnight, but you can see a clear plan. If people have a clear plan and a structure and stability, it's where the success comes from. You know, Man City have had more or less all the staff. They've lost a few to Liverpool, who obviously have took on the same model. But Man City have the same staff that I knew 15, 20 years ago on the circuit are still the same guys working inside the club. It's got bigger, massively bigger, but the core people, the 5 or 6 that were the decision makers back then, are still the decision makers now.
Let's talk a little bit more about that data now, I think. During the course of your career, Curtis, the use of analytics and data became much more prevalent. How did it change your life as a professional? Is it something that the players actually encouraged as the years went by?
I think at first, when you first come about data, it's a little bit of a stigma. I think at first, you know, even if I just talk about videos, first and foremost, when I was a kid coming through at 19, 18, it was a physical video, a VHS tape, which a lot of kids now wouldn't know what a VHS is. So first and foremost, getting your clip sent out to you on a digital platform to watch didn't happen. Whether you'd watch a game at all, it's more you'd probably just watch the one video nasty when you've had a bad 3 or 4-0 defeat, and that's what would happen. And then as time's gone on, you start getting more things when, you know, it's also the level. Now it's at League 2, League 1, all over. But I can say from going from Luton to then West Brom up to the Premier League, you start to see more things that are available to you when there's a bit of money in the building. You know, you start having the GPS on in training, you have the heart rate monitors, all the different things that you start to have. And from there, it's like you say, you build this platform of data, which rightly or wrongly will tell you how you performed in training, tell you how you've done with this, how you've done with that. And I think depending on how you take it, it's very difficult. If you're an overly analytical person on every single aspect of your life, I think it could be a bad thing, because sometimes you might have had a bad training session, but you might have had a bad sleep, and then that's what's caused that, and blah, blah, blah. If you're one of those people that overthink things, that can be a little bit of a problem. But if you're someone that looks at everything with an open mind, you know, I've had times when I've gone to train and I've had maybe 4 hours sleep where I haven't slept well, and I've trained really well. And then other times where I've had a 12-hour sleep, I maybe train awfully because I'm maybe a bit lethargic. So it kind of, as long as you take the rough with the smooth with data, in my opinion, I think that's the way it goes. But over my career, it's changed so drastically that, you know, even football clubs now are recruiting on numbers. You know, it's as Steve said earlier, the eye test isn't there as much anymore. But, you know, you have if you use Tony Bloom as the example, in terms of having data analytics that spits out a number. And is it whether or not you're above this number you get to be seen again? Is it above a certain number you're automatically bought? I don't know how it works exactly, but I think a lot of stuff is done on the computer before they even look at a player with their eyes nowadays.
On Brighton, I think it's a really good example. So I think Brighton and Brentford are obviously the 2 leading lights in terms of data. But I think with regards to Brighton especially, the names get given to the scouts, and then the scouts still decide on which players suit their style, and they go through all the same tests and maybe view a player 10, 15 times before he gets to that decision-making process. So I think where Brighton have been really successful is the numbers determine the scouting, but then the scouts also decide on what type of player really suits them. So I think that's a really good example of success, what Brighton have achieved. There's really good people and a lot of work goes on behind the scenes, but we can't get away from the numbers generate the actual client list that they're going to target. So I think this is the key aspect that they've got different to other football clubs.
Steve, with that, obviously there's been talk about other clubs potentially using the Brighton model and using exactly the same algorithm. So effectively you're saying that the numbers will spit out their targets, but it's for them to go and get scouts to look at it. Now, if you haven't got a scouting network that's as good as Brighton's, effectively would you say it's as effective using their algorithm, or would you say it's better left to the top clubs?
I think, honestly, there's only two clubs with the algorithms and the data that are successful. So I think they have different data to everybody else, and nobody can replicate what Brighton and Brentford have done, because both their owners have data that other clubs cannot get. So it's impossible to compete with that. I think it's, again, you can get an edge by having a clear idea about your footballing identity and having a clear idea about what a right back looks like in Liverpool is totally different than what a right back looks like in Brentford. So there's these things that can make a difference. But in terms of them two, you have to look at them as two totally different to everybody else. The same with Toulouse, the same with St. Gilloise. These have different ways of working to the other clubs.
Listen, it's incredible the way that things have developed in football, just to hear that certain clubs have a secret sauce, if you like, a magic algorithm that's working for them at the moment, very specifically for what they do as football clubs, is so interesting. Maybe every club is out there now, firstly, spending all their money on analysts to see if they can get the same thing, and secondly, on cybersecurity to make sure no one steals their algorithm. The data doesn't just work for football clubs, though, Marlon. It has worked for players too. Famously, Kevin de Bruyne of Manchester City, using a data company as he went in for contract negotiations. The story goes that he presented the data to the club and said, I can still produce and I'm not tailing off, and so I deserve the money that I'm asking for.
I think data for us from the representation side of the business, if you're going in for a contract talk, your main role is to show how well your client is performing. If you can back that up with hard evidence of saying, look, over the last 6 months, these are the performance levels, these are the outputs of my clients, you can demonstrate why your player's at the top. It's almost setting the scene for the contract negotiation. If you go in there and your data is poor, you can't go and negotiate a high contract. You're going to skew your data, or we're going to skew your data. So when you go into that contract conversation, you are right at the top. And that's the one thing with data I would say in all of this, it's the interpretation of the data, okay? From our side, we will look at performance-specific criteria on any one of our players to highlight how well they're doing. Whether that works for another club is down to them. But from our side, we're going in there and saying, right, he has scored X, he's assisted in Y, he's in X amount of goal interactions. This is why the demands are X.
I think this is really interesting as well when talking about the evolution of football and the way deals are done. It used to be agent, player, manager. And then the CEO or whoever will come off and sign off the paperwork. So the fact that Marlon's talking about you have to put together this data pack of analytics that highlight how good your player are shows that you're actually presenting it to a person that needs to make a decision on actual data rather than emotion. Whereas a manager sometimes will have his favourites. He'll have a player that he might not have the best stats, but actually what he brings to the changing room, what he does, week in, week out, the way he works hard, blah, blah, blah. But his stats might not back it up. So that's how football's come along as well. Don't get me wrong, a manager still would be able to, I guess in most clubs, put a strong recommendation into for renewing a player. But it just shows that the person you're presented to now is the person above the manager, no longer the manager to try and get a player a new deal.
Yeah, I think going back to that data pack and the Kevin de Bruyne point, I know another player that saw that and did exactly the same thing, got a data company to produce their own pack. They went to the club and went, here's my data pack. And the club went, we don't care. We don't care. We pay you to do that. That's what we pay you to do, to perform and to hit those levels. So all you're doing is showing us that you're doing what we pay you for.
Not to sound like Roy Keane, it's your job.
That's what it was. So that's where I was like, the data part of this from the player side, it sets the scene for the negotiation. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you just produce a data pack and suddenly you get what you want. You're Kevin de Bruyne, you can do what you want. If you're not Kevin de Bruyne, it's not so simple as here's my data pack and away we go.
Brings us back to the point you made a little bit earlier, Steve. You said it was kind of disappearing. I think you mentioned instinct, but this notion of an eye test, I think fans would call it, right? We see a player, they produce. I don't think the data, for example, for Lionel Messi covering the ground is going to be that high, but he's Lionel Messi, so we all know what he does. Or Erling Haaland, who obviously gets, people saying, well, he doesn't touch the ball that much, but when he does touch it, he puts it in the back of the net. So that's the kind of key statistic that I think most football clubs are looking for. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. So how relevant is the data really when it comes to you seeing a player? Do you really, well, let's put it this way, what percentage does it make up for you in the decision making?
It's difficult to put a percentage, but I think in general terms, it's each person's different who's in a head of recruitment role. I think for myself personally, I was always more with the eye. So I think I worked with really good people like David Pleat and Ian Broomfield, who maybe wasn't the most technical people, but they had an eye for talent. So David Pleat, for example, could tell me about Ollie Watkins when he was at Exeter and predict he was going to be a Premier League player. But not just Ollie Watkins, that's obviously the best example, but he would do it time and time again. And maybe we have a little bit of football snobbery and you say, base, where we bring him in and where do we put him? How long do we have to wait? All these types of things. But it's amazing how many times those people that had the golden eye, who had the intuition to see a player playing in Exeter and predict that he could be a top Premier League player moving forward, you can never look past that. These guys have a skill that data can't provide. They can predict things. They can see things in a player that maybe the data didn't. That maybe that data would say he was going to get to a certain level. David Pleat, Ian Broomfield, and there's many, many others in England. Their eye and their intuition could say, this is going to be a top player moving forward.
From a club's perspective, how important is the opinion of a scout? You guys can make a recommendation, Steve, but how often is it taken on board? I know there's going to be a lot of frustrated scouts all over the world who have that one that got away and they can't believe a club didn't sign. How do you impress on a football club? You really should be making this signing.
It's the same thing. It's character. So I think the character of the scout, as you say, it can be very difficult because you can be sure about a player, but for whatever reason, the club don't want to move forward. It can be really frustrating. It can be financial. It can be, that maybe the head of recruitment doesn't agree with the scout, these types of things. But it's frustrating. But I think if you're adamant and you have strong opinions, then you have to keep on pushing and you have to keep on fighting with the head of recruitment, sporting director, chairman. It can be, you have to push and you have to be adamant and then see if you can get the player over the road. But it can be a frustrating role for sure.
Do the clubs, Marlon, when you've been speaking to them, do they use the data when it suits them? We spoke a little bit earlier on about the player coming in and saying this data's in my favour. Sometimes when you're negotiating a contract, do they bring in the negative data that maybe goes against the player?
I've not had that, but I can understand when the clubs come forward and say, hey, listen, look, can you have a word with your player because this is the data output and he's a little bit low? Or we have to do it ourselves. If he's suddenly not being picked, he's not being picked for a reason. And then you have to go back at performance data and go, right, what is he doing? Why did he come out the team? And I have just give one example of how data really did change for one player that I was looking after. He kept on getting subbed at the 60th minute. And he was a fullback. He gets subbed. And it became a running joke. At first, it was like, okay, fine. It's just the gaffer changing tactics. Every time. And it got to the point where the player was looking at the scoreboard, waiting for 60, and would look across and would know he's coming up. And we sat down and go, why is this? What is going on? Spoke to the manager. And he said, have a look at the data. I was like, okay. We pull the data up. He's Jekyll and Hyde. His first half data compared to his second half data was so wavy. What he was doing was he was tiring as the game was going on, but not understanding he was tiring, trying to make the same actions that he was doing in the first half, but he was probably a yard slower and was losing the ball, getting intercepted. So the data there, negative data or a hint of a negative data from the club, was enough for us to go, actually, hang on, that player's not being chosen because of the negative data.
I think another example of that as well is when you talk about the negative data is as the data side and the analytics were evolving, you'd find more managers as well that maybe didn't know how to use it, but they'd soon use it when it's a negative. they'd use it as a rod to throw at you at first. You know, they'd all of a sudden ask, you know, on a game where you've lost, and it's like, oh, what was our running stats? Oh, what was that compared to the game we won? So they'll compare it to one game that you won. Whereas actually there might have been another game where you hung in for a 1-0 win, didn't have high running stats, but they won't compare it to that one. They'll compare it to the one where you didn't run as much. So I think that's always been a thing. It's as Marlon said, picking out data that suits you. I think some managers have gone down that way as it was evolving, but now a lot more managers will use it generalised in a win, in a loss, in a draw, just so you know where you're at, and just to know, well, we got away with one today, or actually we outperformed them and we lost a game, so we're unlucky.
Did you see that some clubs are more reliant on data in your role, in your experience? Just some present it, you know, whether it's good or bad, that just constantly rely on the data compared to other clubs?
Yeah, I think there's some clubs that if you're looking at signing players, they will only sign a player if they fit within a certain criteria.
Really?
Doesn't matter what that player has done. It could even be an age criteria. If your player is above the age criteria, doesn't matter what they do, that certain club will not sign them. And I think it goes back to what you said, Steve, about the clubs having their own plan, their own specific plan of what their recruitment strategy looks like and sticking to it. And there are certain clubs where some put availability. So if a player hasn't been available for 70% of minutes over the last, say, 3 years, they're a risk. They flag up as a risk. They will not sign that player. He could be injured for a year, come back and have an amazing 2 years. But if he goes under the 70% at any point, nope, not touching him.
That's crazy for me hearing that, because I as a 35-year-old did my Achilles, ruptured my Achilles, then 36 the end of the season. But then the next season at 36, 37, I played every single minute. So that's me as a 37-year-old. So if you're saying that about potentially a 24, 25-year-old to almost write them off, that for me is
it's
crazy.
Risk management. It's risk management. They're going, okay, look, if we're going to input 25, 30, 40 million into a player, I don't want red flags around robustness or how many games he's going to appear, or if that hamstring keeps on reoccurring. So I don't care how good he is. If he has that, he's not coming in.
Do you also think that's them covering their own back? Because obviously there's certain ones that a manager will really want, but is it them saying, well, we really like him as well, but the fact that this has come, actually we just won't do it?
Yeah, it's risk.
It's interesting, by the way, just to hear you say that after your injury and given your age that you played every single minute, because there was no risk management there. They were getting their full money's worth when it comes to Curtis Davies.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of money on it, to be honest. And but it's one of those situations. It's a strange thing. Obviously, we're going on to injury here, but it's a strange thing because I almost felt like at that age, my body had a rest. So whilst my Achilles had the injury and I had to rehab my Achilles, the rest of my body, my hips, my knees, everything else got a rest. And I think that's what allowed me to play those 48 games the next season. And obviously I'm now retired.
It's probably gone down to contract length. So if I'm signing someone for 30, 40 million, I'm putting a 4 or 5 year contract down. As an older the player gets, you're probably looking at a one.
Of course.
Yeah, but if we look at the modern trends today, Curtis, your old teammates now and the ones, you can see this new trend of younger players, big investment.
Yeah.
The middle age group and more 2-3 year contracts now, less value in terms of what you're paying. And once you get to 28, it's becoming really difficult. So in terms of the business model of most Premier League clubs, Championship clubs today is to try to recruit under the age of 24. So I think when you're investing big money, it's under that age. But we see so many players today struggling for clubs, even free players. You look at Rabiot, for example, in Juve this summer. He's left Juve thinking he was going to get a similar type of club, ran his contract down, and all of a sudden he's in a club that didn't even qualify for European Football Club, a massive, massive football club. But I don't think he would have intended on being in Marseille when he left his contract in Juve. And I think this is just one example. De Gea spent a full year out of football. There's most of the clubs today are trying to recruit young players with asset values who they think they can see, okay, if we make an investment here, by the time the player's 26, we're going to probably cash in on him and try to generate big money on him. Otherwise, we start to really depreciate in value.
Would you say that's also a level of ego, though, as well, Steve, in terms of, De Gea reportedly was earning around 300 grand a week at Manchester United, and then to get offers elsewhere, maybe of, I'm obviously just making an example, maybe 50 grand a week. Is that a case of thinking his value is more? And don't get me wrong, you should value yourself as a player, but if you really want to play, do you think maybe sometimes a player has to suck it up and take that?
Yeah, but I imagine also De Gea had offers from Saudi. So I'm sure it's not just financial.
Mm-hmm.
Ego in terms of the size of club, I'm sure, because we all have ego. We're all in football. We all have an ego. Every single person who works in football has an ego. So I imagine from the player's perspective, he thought he was going to find a similar type of club. But I think with De Gea as the example, it wouldn't have been money, because I'm sure he could have gone to the Middle East and earned significantly more than he was on in Man United if he wanted to, with his name and his capabilities. So I think it's each by one. But when you look at people like himself and Rabiot, I'm sure they expected bigger clubs than the ones they ended up at.
What's just interesting to me, listening to you guys talk about, De Gea, about yourself as well, is, we're analysing data here and analytics, but there is a human element to all of these things, scouting and recruitment. And Steve, I was intrigued to know, you can't really put an analytic number on the character of a player.
No.
How much you care about that when you're scouting, the personality?
Massive.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I think all my mistakes have been on the character. So I think 10 years ago, it was less. So it'd be more on that interaction in the meeting that you had with the player, how the manager felt with that player. Normally, you'd meet a player a couple of times, hopefully with a family member, so you can feel the family as well and the understanding. The agent can also give you an indication of how the player is going to be and how much that agent has got influence on the player. So there's all these aspects that you look into, but it's gone far further now. I spoke to a club the other week who employ 6 people that just analyse everything about that player. So what he's eating, how he is with his teammates, how he is in social media, how he behaves in nightclubs, how many times a week does he go out, what type of food does he eat. They're employing 6 to 8 people across Europe that will get given, 5 players, and they will have to try to detect everything about that character to reduce the risk. So it's really evolving. But yeah, like I say, it's very difficult to make mistakes on players in terms of the qualities, because to be at this level and to spend so much money, you have to have qualities. But the biggest problem comes how they're going to adapt to that dressing room, how they're going to adapt to the manager's requirements. We all fall in love with footballers. We watch football every week. We fall in love with the silky players with the great skills and ability. But it's how they're going to adapt, how they're going to function in this team. They're the things that are becoming even more prevalent now than they used to be.
Steve, you mentioned some of your mistakes there. Can you tell us who and why you felt it was such a mistake around character?
I think the obvious one, I don't want to talk too much about the previous things that have gone on and players and character, but I think it's only fair when you spend a certain amount of money on a certain type of player, you expect more. So in terms of, I think the biggest mistake, it's obvious, with Ndombele when I was at Tottenham. And for sure, I didn't make a mistake about the footballer. The footballer is amazing. Like when he's on it, and we've seen performances, myself and the coaching staff at the time, we've seen performances in Man City away, Man City at home, where he was the best, arguably the best player on the pitch. You go to Barcelona and he's the one who takes the most responsibility and is probably the best player on the pitch. And he had performances like that for Tottenham also. But in terms of the character, we believed, because the romantic in us, like always, believes that we can change a player. We can change the mentality. If we put them in our environment, we can change that person. That's the biggest mistake, because the characteristics of a player is always going to be the characteristics of a player. You can improve them a little bit. You can make them a little bit more professional, but always it comes down to that player. And if that player's not, I think after 1 year, I pulled the agent, or maybe even less than a year. And I said, this player has everything to be a Real Madrid player, but he could also be back in France in a few years, thinking, and now we're looking at him at 27 in Nice, still a fantastic footballer. But there's a reason why he's in Nice and he's not in Real Madrid, because football-wise, he should be in Real Madrid.
Steve, would you say when you spoke about the team that goes behind even just looking at a player's character now, is it almost like forensic, almost like a private detective type thing nowadays in terms of, you have to scroll through the social media, see what they're up to, are they out on the weekends and doing this and doing that? But does it almost go down to that kind of side in terms of, rather than just, as you said, it goes further than the normal chat now? How deep does it go?
So some clubs do hire private detectives. We didn't, but a lot of clubs do. And I think it's common sense. I think if you're spending 60 million and you're a businessman and you're spending 60 million, you want to know everything about that business. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with an asset in a footballer. If you're going to spend 60 million and you're going to make a mistake about the character or the way he is away from the pitch, then you should be reducing that risk, and it's certainly something a lot of clubs are doing more today than they did in the past. And I think it's only going to get more.
When I said earlier on about the character of a player and personality, you said massive straight away. Is it the same for you as it might be if you were working in a football club? When you think about your clients, how important is character?
I think character, the reason why I jumped and said massive is I have lost deals because the client at the time didn't understand how his attitude or mentality was going to come across. And a lot of the education is education on body language, how you live your life away from the pitch. But the one example which cost the player a massive move was mainly out of complete immaturity. And it was enough to lose him a move. And it all happened before a ball was even kicked. So we can talk about the data. This player was flagged up on data, had all the boxes ticked, I suppose. The last box was manager coming down to watch. So he'd been told, all approved, scouting department, tick, 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 tick. The manager got there for the game. During the warm-up, and bear in mind, this was a player, I'm not going to name the name because I don't think it's very fair, but he was playing for a team that was in a relegation battle. And the reason why there was a bit of a hoo-ha around the player was because everyone was thinking, if his team go down, he's the one that's going to get bought out, okay? Manager turns up. He's there early. I'm in the stands watching, thinking, if he does something well, I'm going to see the manager applaud or do something. During the warm-up, the player is, how shall I say, interacting with fans, waving, shaking hands, taking photos. In the warm-up, mucking around, doing kick-ups, showing off. I didn't think anything of it. You don't at that point. You learn as you go on. At the end of the game, speaking, the player was okay during the game. Nothing amazing, but nothing poor in that performance. Deal didn't happen because a manager, his viewpoint after seeing him clown around in pre-match was, if my team are getting relegated, I do not want a single player thinking that it's okay to do that it's okay before a match to interact with fans. I want laser focus. So he doesn't fit my bill. So that was nothing to do with what he did on the pitch. It was pure character.
What that also points to is something that I think a lot of fans might think at the moment doesn't happen, that the manager gets the final say, that players are just bought for clubs and the manager just has to coach them. That is a very clear and obvious example, Curtis, of the manager having the final say.
Yeah, Steve will be able to tell you more, but from what I've been told with certain clubs, it's kind of, you have your list of what you'd like on a profile that you'd like, and maybe names. And then they'll go out and potentially look at that name, look at others alongside it, and then you'll piece together a package and you'll go through it as a team. Usually the manager, be it assistant manager, be it the directors of football and the chairman, whatever it's going to be, there's like a leadership kind of ownership group in terms that make that decision. That's what I've been told.
If you look at coaches today, they go to less and less games than they used to in the past. So I think David Moyes was an anomaly in terms of the volume of games he used to go to and be seen at. I think to reduce the risk again, because most of our discussions are about reducing risks, I think that coach only sees that one game that Marlon speaks about before, where the scout's probably seen that player 15 times. So I think sometimes that's going back to the scout and being annoyed or upset and undervalued I think that's when they feel undervalued, when they go to watch a player 10, 15 times a show, seeing him play so many games, and then a manager makes a snapshot opinion of a player. In terms of the preparation for head coaches and the type of work that goes on behind the scenes now, you normally take a longer list, so 4 to 5 players to a coach for each position. Hopefully, again, looking at the key characteristics that he's looking for a player and the football club's looking for a player. And then it'll come down to which players he likes, which player the sporting director likes, and which ones are affordable for the football club, because then you have to start to speak with the agents, find out how much money the player's looking for, try to speak to the clubs and find out how much they're looking for the player. And that makes a big part of the decision. So you always end up, you always start with the best player, the number one, and then sometimes you end up with the third player down the list because of contract problems, the player prefers another club, whatever can develop. But in terms of the list, you normally start with about 5 players that you present to a coach. And by that presentation, it can be all statistical. It can be the scouts' reports that they formulated over that period of time. So there's quite a lot of effort, quite a lot of work goes into producing these lists for the coach. But I think the coach always has to, well, all the coaches that I've worked with in the past, I've always had a massive say in the player that comes inside the football club.
Steve, when you have that list of 4 or 5, will they sit down and literally each of you, whoever's in that group of 4 people deciding, would it be that you literally go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And will the manager or be it a chairman or director of football, will they get a veto on a certain name? How does that exactly work?
I'm sure it's different in every football club. I can only speak from my experience. So if we was presenting to one of our coaches and to the chairman, we would try to find a player that fitted into, that we knew the criteria of what type of salary he'd be looking for, what type of transfer fee it was going to be, because there's no point in getting a manager excited because it creates more problems than it's worth. So you're looking already inside the ballpark figures of where you're going to be as a football club. So you have the economics of the football club already inside your thought process. Then when you're making this 4 or 5 player list, like I say, I think the coach will have a big say, the sporting director will have a say, and obviously the most important thing is that you have the finances to do it. But all these decisions will be made collectively. I think very rarely now do you get one person having the complete say on anything.
Do you get emotionally attached to any targets?
Massively.
So if you're watching,
Massively.
you're thinking, he's the one for me, he's the one, he's number 1 at the top, and you don't get him, you're like, oh, come on.
Yeah, no, there's many stories like this, and it's, and then you're also judged by the player that does come in, and he could be the 3rd on the list or the 5th on the list sometimes, depending on how it ends up. But in terms of that number 1, that player that you think is going to dramatically improve, and maybe the coach disagrees with you, and you have, internal problems in terms of the disagreements there. But if you believe there is your number 1, you have to fight. You have to fight to try to get him in. You have to fight. You have to explain to the coach why you've come to this decision. But again, everything, you've got to fail together, or you've got to have the success together. And I think where you see the successful stories in football clubs, it's mainly when everybody has an idea about the club, the structure, the idea of how it's going to be when you first enter the building as a coach. And then the ones that have stability and a simple way of playing. I think that going back to that again, it's so important.
I'm going to put you on the spot, all right?
Yeah.
And Curtis is going to you as well. How do you tell a player he's your number 1 target if he was actually number 4 on the list?
You have to tell them all they're number 1. So you have to make them believe that they're always number 1.
And Curtis, did you know when you did your moves, did you think I'm the one they always wanted?
It's on the balance of what they've spent on you. So when I went for West Brom, for instance, I was a record signing. So I'd like to think I was number 1 on the list. And then you go to Aston Villa after that. I always thought I was going Tottenham at that time. Never happened. Aston Villa came up with the money above what Tottenham were going to pay and bought me. So you'd like to think, again, I am number 1 on this because they've stretched out further than another football club that's fighting in and around that kind of top 6 area. So yeah, I'd like to think when I did go places, I was number 1. But as I said, as long as when I got there, I did the business, which fortunately most clubs I did to start with anyway. And then that's all that matters.
You spoke about the emotional attachment, Steve. Who is the signing that you're most proud of making, of being involved in the process for?
Difficult. I think the obvious ones are obviously the bigger names, but in terms of the one that I probably got the most satisfaction from was probably somebody like Asu Okotoru. You sign for relatively small amount of money, so the actual reward of having somebody like that performed week in, week out at Premier League level, shown really good qualities. Probably if he was at another club would have gone on and be sold earlier on after 2 or 3 years, ended up staying at Spurs for a long period of time. I think those type of players are the ones you get the most satisfaction from, because it's a risk, because you're not he's not at the, how can I say, when you sign Luis Suarez or somebody like this, it's just, you're paying record amounts at the time. So he has to be good. There's no option. When you sign somebody like Asu Okotoru, who's small transfer fee, and they go on to be a Premier League player and really kick on in their career, they're the rewarding ones. They're the ones that, make you feel proud.
Speaking of Asu Okotoru, if he were to do the character test,
he'd fail,
would he fail?
He'd fail now, yeah.
Because he notoriously is someone that was very good at football, was paid well at football, but didn't like football.
Just described it as a job, didn't he? He said it's a job. I'm not too much into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't know if he would fail, actually, because if you look at the character of a player, we've all worked with different types of characters, different ones in the dressing room that portray different things. Now, Ben White is probably done exactly the same as Benoit. So Ben White there's no stories about him away from the pitch or problems away from the pitch, but there's a lot of stories about him not watching football, him not being,
Can I just get back in there? Sorry, Steve, I apologise, but
no worries.
Do you think if he made those comments about not watching football and not really being into football when he was at Brighton, that Arsenal would have then spent £50 million on him?
Yes, I think they would, because what's he actually saying? I am passionate about football. I watch 2 to 3 games a day because it's my passion, but it doesn't mean I could play at Ben White's level. So Ben White has different things away from football than I have. So I don't think this type of thing is it's an amber warning, maybe. If you're doing the tick box of all the characteristics you're looking for in a player, of course you want somebody who studies football and everything, but that's not going to be a decision maker. And it was the same with Benoit. You put him on a pitch, he thought he was passionate, he had a massive love for football. But away from the pitch, he had other things that he enjoyed doing.
I think it's a character. When we talk about the character test, are things away from the pitch going to interfere with the performance on the pitch? If he's got a liking to going out 3 times a week, is that going to cause a problem at the weekend? Mm-hmm. I think with the Ben White issue and Asu Okotoru, it never affected the performance on the pitch. And I think that's where it wouldn't flag up.
I asked you about the signing you're most proud of, Steve. What about the one that got away?
Too many. No, in terms of the ones that I think would have made a big difference at the time, we were very close to getting Jack Grealish, which would have been, for the value that we would have got him for in that period of time, would have been probably one of the best signings. Jack Grealish was a Tottenham player. He would have set the place alight. He had the skills. He would have got the fans off the seat. He would have been a difference in that time. We had Dele Alli at that time, and I think them two would have pushed each other as well. And so I think to miss out on that player was massive in that period. And then I also really, and this wasn't the club or it wasn't any other consequence. It was just because Barcelona came. We were really close to getting Frenkie de Jong, and I think Frenkie de Jong again is a Tottenham player. I think he would have made a big difference for us. We had to replace the irreplaceable in Ndombele, and I think probably Frenkie could have been not Ndombele because different characteristics, but he could have got into that position and really succeeded at Spurs.
Don't feel bad about Frenkie de Jong, because I've seen a scout's recommendation for Swansea City when he was at Willem II that they didn't even respond to. Okay, so they could have signed him as well. Swansea City obviously weren't interested. There you go. Which actually it points me towards what I wanted to discuss next, which is the life of a scout, because that is someone who was in another part of the world, sending reports back to a club in the UK. How do you become a scout? How do you end up out there on the road, whether that be here in the UK, whether it be globally? And what is that lifestyle like?
Going back to it again, I think there's all different types of scouts. I think a lot of the scouts today are ex-players. So I think there's a football background there. I think it's the easiest way to get into football, because I think a lot of people gravitate towards ex-players. So there's no getting away from that. It's not necessary to be an ex-player. I think some of the best scouts I've been around, the Steve Rowleys in the past and people like that, they wasn't ex-players. So I think they had a clear idea of football. They had a contact book, which is probably one of the scouts' greatest things. But there's many ways to get into it: grassroots level, academy level, scouting there, building your knowledge in that way. I think in terms of first team, once you're in, it's the most rewarding job, the most fantastic job. To get paid to watch football is amazing. I mean, to travel to South America to watch Boca River and to watch these great games of football, and to watch players, and to sometimes to be part of a player's career all the way through, and to feel so proud to see that player kick on and achieve what he does. There's not many more rewarding jobs. And I remember me and Fabio talking, Fabio Paratici, who came into Spurs, and we both said the thing we miss the most is that going to games, enjoying football, the camaraderie after you go for dinner and be around other like-minded people is so rewarding, such a great job. I think today most of the sporting directors have been ex-scouts, and they all miss those days when you was going to football, enjoying life. But it's difficult. As an example, I got up this Sunday to go to a game in Belgium. Got up at 5:00, drove into London to meet somebody, went to the game, watched the game at 4 p.m, got home at 2 a.m. in the morning. So it's not always easy, but if you have the passion and the enjoyment and you love watching football, it's amazing profession.
Steve, with that being said about you travelling and actually having feet on the ground, how much do you think Y-Scout has changed everything in terms of people being able to just click on their computer, search for a player, and rather than actually just watch the whole game, they can watch their attacking clips, they can watch their defensive clips, and they can just pick points that they want to check on that player?
A lot of the times, myself, Y-Scout's been around a while, and it's a fantastic tool. I think it's good to go back over the game sometimes to watch the clips of the performance that you've watched live, to challenge yourself. The same again, going back to data. Data should be used to challenge the eye, and vice versa. So I think in terms of Y-Scout, I think it gives you an idea. Sometimes you can be I love to be in the stadium. I love to smell the grass. I love to be around people. If you go to an away game and you listen to the away fans talk about players, they're quite knowledgeable. When they're giving the players a bit of stick, you can see the consistency or the inconsistency in a player because the fans let you know. So there's all these little things that when you go live, you can't replicate watching a video, but the video is a great tool to use in the right way. And if you're watching a goalkeeper or a central defender and you can watch those clips, because maybe the defender doesn't have much to do, but you can see where he is in relation to the box and how his body was and stuff like this. When you go to make that report after you've been to the game live, it just gives you extra ammunition for the report and to make a calculated opinion.
Final point then on data analytics, something that I wanted to throw in, artificial intelligence. How much more could we see in the world of data in the coming years? So, gentlemen, I just wanted to ask you, where do you see the future of data in football? Just to end. Curtis, I'll start with you.
That's a really interesting
I'm
question.
so delighted you started with
Yeah,
Curtis.
well, that's it. It's somewhere where it is at the forefront of everything. Every single thing we do, being a broadcaster as well, it's almost, I've seen the game with my eyes, but I need to back that up with data for everyone to listen. You know, kind of that kind of thing. So it's almost like whatever you see with your eyes, you need a backup plan, which is the data. So I feel like it's only going to get stronger and stronger. We're going to be analysing more minute details as we go along, which then makes the algorithm even stronger and even more watertight. But yeah, I can only see it getting stronger and stronger as we move on.
I think we're going to go to more and more predictive models. So during games, in-game situations, if you're losing, maybe AI can analyse 3 or 4 or 5 different tactical changes a manager can make, and then you can see multiple options or multiple results of changes. I think predictive models are going to be the future. I think how that lies with player stats, I still don't know if you can accurately predict, based purely on stats, how that player is going to fit in your team. Because like we said at the start, there are humans. They're not just numbers and robots you can plug in and play. So I think the eye or the talent or talent spotting is always going to be up there. I don't think AI will ever take over. I could be wrong.
Maybe. We might get AI scouts. What do you think, Steve?
AI podcasts.
I know a club that gives the coach on a Friday, if the game's on Saturday, gives them what they believe should be the team for the weekend. So we're already getting to a point where it's evolving into this, you know, because this will be based on the data and everything. But that coach still has that intuition, you know, still has that feel. He's watched training every week. He knows where a player's levels are going to be. And I think, of course, we can reduce risks as we keep on talking about, but we can never lose that human quality of coaching, scouting, everybody that works inside of football. We can never lose that. But it's only going to get stronger as we could move forward.
I can see it happening. Someone's going to put a computer in charge of their team for the weekend. It will happen, I'm sure. Steve Hitchen, been a real pleasure to have you with us. Really appreciate you joining us on Decision Makers.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Gentlemen, I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Really engaging, really interesting conversation. So Marlon, Curtis, thank you very much. We'll be back again very, very soon indeed. Make sure you're there as well. Remember, you can follow us on the social channels for the Decision Makers. It's in the podcast description, so make sure you check that out now. Make sure you subscribe as well. And if you enjoyed the podcast, also leave a review, tell your mates as well. We'll be back very, very soon with another great episode delving into what goes on behind the scenes in the game we all love. We'll see you then.